This is information.
In this video, we'll talk about page layout with positioning and alignment, the display property, overflow, setting your width and height, and floating. Before we get deep into page layout, let's go to Flow. The browser renders content from top to bottom and left to right. So all of our discussions about page layout have this as an underlying principle. To move things around in a layout, we're either working with or against the flow. Positioning. The CSS property position has 5 major values. Static, which is the default. Relative, which moves an element in relation to its original position. Surrounding elements stay in their normal positions as they would normally flow. We can specify how the relatively positioned element moves using top, right, bottom, and left. When we use these directions, always think from the top or from the right, whichever direction you pick, and whichever numbers you choose. Usually, it'll be pixels or ems or percentages, like in this example. We also have absolute, which removes the element from the flow completely. The surrounding elements ignore the absolutely positioned element. Again, we have top, right, bottom, and left to use to specify where the absolutely positioned element goes. Check out this example. We also have fixed, and never scrolls. Only with some CSS can we move this fixed element. Yet again, we use top, right, bottom, and left directions. There's also position sticky, which is like a combination of relative and fixed. This is experimental, so it may not work depending on your browser. In this example, the element acts like it is relatively positioned until it reaches a certain threshold, in this case, 100 pixels from the top. Then it will be fixed position 100 pixels from the top until the viewport is scrolled past the threshold. A real-life example of this is when you scroll through your iPod or iPhone music, the B stays at the top until all the B entries are scrolled through, and the C stays at the top, and so on. So that was positioning. Before we move on to alignment, let's take a moment to introduce z-index. We can assign z-index to elements that make them overlap. The default is 0, and higher zx numbers go on top of lower numbers. You can even make them negative. Alignment. Alignment can be tricky in that some things work for certain elements and other things only work for other elements, so you'll probably try all of them until you get something to work. There is centering using margin 0 auto. In this example, the div is centered using margin 0 auto. If we remember back to margin shorthand, the 0 represents top and bottom, and auto represents left and right. Margin 0 auto only works if you set as width for your div and you have the correct doc type at the top of your HTML. We'll talk more about height and width later. We also have the text-align CSS property. Even though the word text is included in it, it does more than just align text. It aligns any inline or inline block elements in a container. We'll get to inline block very soon. But for now, we can assign values of left, right, center, justify, and inherit. Let's look at these examples. There are a couple of other experimental values for text-align. You can read up on them at CSS Tricks or Mozilla Developer Network. The display property. We need to jump back into a discussion of inline and block elements to talk about the display property. Display inline causes a block level element to act like an inline element. Look at this example. Display block does the opposite. Display list item displays a box in a way that you would normally do with a li list element. To make this work properly, your content should be nested in an ul or an ol element. Display none causes the element not to be displayed or even be there at all. Look at this example. When I apply the display none to the second paragraph, the first paragraph runs right into the third paragraph. You may have seen, or yourself used, visibility hidden, which is kind of similar to display none. The visibility hidden declaration keeps the element and its flow in place, but doesn't visually show it. So in that last example with the 3 paragraphs, if I did visibility hidden instead, there is a blank space where the second paragraph is. Display inline block causes a block level element to flow like an inline element, while retaining other features of a block level element, as you can see here. It is possible to use display table to create column-based tables in CSS, as opposed to row-based tables using HTML. It is rarely used because this is one instance where you really don't want to use CSS for content, because it can get messy in the browser fast, and secondly, older browsers struggle with CSS tables. So I suggest steering clear of display table. If you really want to learn more about it, I suggest going to MDN. Overflow. Next up, we have the overflow property in CSS. With the overflow property, we control how things look when they are bigger than the container box. With overflow auto, a scroll bar appears if necessary, and you can scroll to see the rest of the content, like in this example. With overflow hidden, the overflow content is clipped. This is kind of like visibility hidden, just for overflow content, like in this example. With overflow scroll, the content is clipped and a scroll bar is added to the box so you can scroll through the content that doesn't fit in your container, like in this example. With overflow visible, the overflow content is not clipped and could be visible outside of your container. Height and width. By default, a box is big enough to fit your content. This is almost always not enough for us, so we need to set heights and widths of our divs or whatever containers we're working with. Traditionally, pixels have been the unit of choice for box sizes, but as we've been moving toward a responsive web, percentages and ems have become more popular. Speaking of responsive web, we will often be called to set a min width or a max width to account for expanding and shrinking pages. This is helpful for legibility, as you may not want a very wide window if you have a lot of text, or a very narrow window for that matter. The same goes for height. We have min height and max height available to us. And now, let's talk floating. The float property allows us to take something in a normal flow and place it as far to the left or right of the containing element as possible, and text and inline elements will wrap around it. So if we use float left, that element will float on the left side of the container block. and vice versa for float right. Float none decrees that the element must not float. Almost always, you need to have a width specified for your elements, otherwise the floats don't function properly or display consistently.